Morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. And today we're going over chapter 8, maybe 9 and 10 of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So, Smith begins the 8th chapter of his magnum opus by defining the produce of labor as the natural recompense of labor or labor's wages. Prior to the appropriation of land and capital, in what he calls the original state of things, the laborer has neither landlord nor master to share with. If this state had continued, labor's wages would have grown with all the improvements to productive power. Produced by the division of labor, everything would have become more affordable gradually over time, and less labor would have been required for production. However, even though things might have been cheaper in reality, it may appear that they were rarer on the surface. Adam's line of thinking supposes a world where labor's productive power grew tenfold, so that 10 times the amount could be produced with a single day's labor. At the same time, another industry may have only seen an increase of double, so workers produced twice the original amount in a day. When they exchanged, the laborer who produced tenfold would only receive twice what a day's labor could have obtained from the lesser improved industry. As such, a dollar would appear to be 5 times more precious than it was previously, despite it actually being twice as cheap in reality. Even though the price was 5 times higher, the workers' elevated wages would mean they spent half the time to purchase it. The original state, where laborers could command the whole produce of their labor, would not last beyond the acquisition of private property and capital. Thus, this state ended way before the most substantial improvements occurred in the productive powers of labor, and envisioning a world where this state of affairs continued would be fruitless. Once land is converted into private holdings, landlords demand a share of all production in the form of a payment. Rarely will a person who farms the land have enough resources to sustain himself until the harvest. A typical farmer receives an advance from his master, or what we would call an employer today. This person would not have any interest in employing the entry-level farmer if they did not expect a share in his production. Thus, the landlord's rent makes up the first deduction, and the profit to the master makes up the second. Nearly all labor is liable to profit-based deductions, and almost every industry has workers in need of an employer who advances them their wages. Occasionally, a single independent worker, what we might call an independent contractor, has sufficient capital to purchase his work materials and sustain himself until the completion of his work. In this case, Smith says he is both the master and the laborer, and he enjoys the whole fruit of his produce, not sharing with the employer or with the landlord, and he consolidates what are usually 2 distinct portions of revenue, profit and wages. These men are rare, though, and according to Adam's calculations, there are 20 workers working with an employer to every 1 independent contractor. The common wages of labor depends on a contract made between 2 parties who have separate interests. Workmen wish to obtain as much, and employers wish to give as little as possible. It is evident who has the advantage in this exchange, and who can force the other into compliance. Masters, the employers, who are few in number, can more easily organize, and the law does not prohibit their collusion. On the other hand, authorities have made it illegal for the workers to organize during Smith's time, and things have changed, and it's not as legal for large employers, monopoly, antitrust laws, and whatnot. But back then, there were no such things, so employers were able to collude much more easily. And he states there were no acts of Parliament against combining to lower wages, while there were many against combining to raise it. Today we have unions. Back then, it was illegal to unionize. Although there are certainly people out there who would love to make it illegal to unionize again. In the case of a dispute, employers can outlast workers without payment. Almost all business owners can survive at least a year or 2 without income, but the majority of workers can scarcely last a week. All the paycheck people out there today. Even though workers are as necessary to their masters as the masters are to them, the need is not so immediate. And similarly today, a company would not be able to survive without its employees, but the employees are way more dependent on an immediate paycheck than the employers are on the work of their laborers. If their people stopped working, for most companies, they could pretty much replace the whole staff pretty easily. News hardly ever announces when large employers engage in collusion, but they always alert us to the latest strikes. However, if we take this to mean that the wealthy do not collude, we would only be deluding ourselves. Smith says masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit combination not to raise wages above their actual rate. Violating this organization is a terribly unpopular thing to do, and is a reproach to the master according to Smith's view. He tells us we never hear of these organizations because they are the usual state of things. From time to time, masters may even collude with each other to lower wages below their market rate, and these matters are conducted in the utmost secrecy. Think of the Table of Rome, or even just like the Fortune 500 would be a great example. The leaders of those organizations all talk to each other, and I am certain what they talk about in private may not always be in the best interest of their workers. Sometimes workmen fold without any resistance and accept the lower wages, but on other occasions they combine and form unions to combat this forceful assault on their earnings. Unionized workers blame the cost of living or the unbelievable profits enjoyed by the corporation's owners. Whether these organizations are offensive or defensive, they are reported on frequently. And we still see news today about labor unions organizing and going on strikes. I believe just here recently there was like a port strike. It ended with like a 30 or 40% raise for the workers, I believe. To bring about a speedy decision, union strikers resort to the loudest clamor and act with the folly and extravagance of desperate men. On the other side, masters act with equal clamor and call upon civil authorities to shut down the strikes. Due to the owner's stability, interference of civil authority, and the workman's necessity, these violent affairs rarely lead to any real advantage for the strikers. Most of the time, they only lead to the punishment and ruin of any of the ringleaders. However, even though employers have the general advantage, they cannot drop wages below a certain rate for any length of time. A man's wages must be at least enough to cover his sustenance, and they should leave a little left over beyond this, otherwise raising a family would be an impossibility. And according to Mr. Cantillon, another famous economist from Smith's time, even the lowest among the workers should be afforded twice the cost of his maintenance so he can raise 2 children. Under certain conditions, laborers may actually gain the upper hand, enabling them to raise their wages far above the natural rate. Countries with continual growth and rising employment do not give the common worker an opportunity to organize with their brethren. In fact, the scarcity of hands gives rise to competition among employers, and they bid against each other, vying for more labor. And we still see some of this kind of behavior in certain industries, like once the lockdowns went into effect, there was a massive increase in demand for software engineers, for example, because everything shifted online. And there just weren't enough people that were trained and qualified for that. Demand for wage labor increases in proportion to the funds destined to pay wages. These are derived from 2 places: the revenue in excess of maintenance and the stock above what is necessary to sustain the corporations. Smith argues that when landlords and moneyed men find themselves with more capital than they need for maintenance of their families, they will employ more people. Sounds somewhat similar to the trickle-down economics. I don't know if I agree with that. As this surplus increases, he will hire more and more. Independent workers will do the same. When they have more stock than what is sufficient for work materials and the need of family, he will add a journeyman or 2 to his employment. And obviously, if they don't have enough to even sustain themselves, they're definitely not going to hire more people. But we have seen record profits in today's world, and the unemployment rate has hovered around 4 or 5%. So I'm not sure just how accurate this is. I mean, obviously it's accurate to a point, but let's continue. As the revenue and capital of a country increases, so does the demand for laborers. Increasing revenues and stock are direct augmentation of national wealth, and the demand for wage earners correlates with the rise of a nation's wealth. Rather than the total amount of wealth, Smith argues it is the continual increase that gives rise to greater demand for workers. Therefore, the richest countries may not experience the highest wages, but the nation which is thriving and becoming rich the fastest. And there is certainly some truth to that as well. At the time of his writing, Smith saw how Europe possessed much greater wealth than North America, but the wage earners in the Americas received much higher pay. New Yorkers were commonly paid 3 shillings and 6 pence in 1773, and a ship carpenter might earn as much as 10 shillings and 6 pence. These were substantially higher than what would be earned for similar work in England, and the price of provisions was lower in the Americas as well. Even though North America had less overall wealth than England at the time, Smith saw it as the more thriving of the two. One of the most striking measures of a nation's prosperity is the growth of its population. And we're seeing in basically all developed nations a rapid slowdown of population growth today. And populations were growing nearly 20 times quicker in the Americas compared to England, the mother country, back then. He claimed the rapid explosion of people was not due to immigrants, but actually because of birth rates. According to his estimates, those who lived to old age might have seen between 50 to 100 descendants during their lifetime. He believed that since labor was so well paid, children were not a burden, but a source of familial opulence and parental prosperity. Even if we find the wealth of a country to be great, if the velocity of money is stagnant, we would not anticipate wages to be high. Part of the reason for this stagnation would be how little the demand for labor fluctuates from year to year. If a nation's labor needs have remained the same for centuries, they may never find themselves in a shortage of hands, and that would push down the cost of wages. On the contrary, the number of workers might multiply beyond the employer's needs, pushing down the prevailing wages. A constant scarcity of employment would motivate unemployed workers to accept lower wages, otherwise they would face starvation. Smith comments on the opulent wealth in China and said it would have had long been one of the wealthiest and most fertile nations on earth. Yet it barely grew for hundreds of years. Travelers described their voyages similarly to how Marco Polo had described his 500 years previously. All their descriptions commented on the workers' low wages and how difficult it was for them to find steady employment. Even the artisans were hungry. Instead of waiting for people to ask them for services, they plied their trade out in the streets, basically begging to work. Among the lowest-ranked members of Chinese society, poverty surpassed even the poorest European nations. However, despite the lack of growth in China, they still had sufficient work to support their laborers and their families. Smith asks us to imagine what would be the case in a nation where decay in the annual labor demand made it drop from year to year. Even those who were born well off might find themselves looking for work in lower wage positions. And at the lowest levels, competition would be so fierce that wages would be pushed down to the most miserable and scanty conditions. Many would not be capable of finding gainful employment still, and they would either starve or be driven to a life of begging and crime. Smith wrote that want, famine, and mortality would immediately prevail in that class. These forces would extend into the upper classes and continue influencing the population until there were only enough inhabitants to fulfill the demand for labor. Smith's thoughts on this were best illustrated by the domination of mercantile companies in the East Indies. He asked his readers to compare the state over there with that of the North Americas, and told us it was a great example of the difference between corporate governance and the brilliance of the British Constitution. As we know, the British East India Company went over to the East Indies and dominated the population and caused many people to starve to death while harvesting all the profits for themselves and sending the money back to England. And a couple of very wealthy merchants became the equivalent to billionaires, while entire nations over there were driven into poverty. And ultimately, there was nothing distinguishing this relatively undeveloped land from the Americas, and there was such a different experience of what happened in North America in particularly. And Smith is just saying that it all came down to how those areas were run. Generous rewards for labor are both the effect and symptom of increasing national wealth. Likewise, the poverty of the laboring class is a sign that nations are either stagnant or regressing. During the time of Smith, Great Britain paid workers enough to raise a family, and he does not go into precise calculations of what this amount would have been, only to say that families were not struggling. However, he does bring up the distinction between summer and winter wages, being that wages are highest during the summer months, yet the cost to maintain someone's family are highest during the winter, on account of the cost of fuel. Laborers were told to retain a portion of their wages to sustain themselves through the colder months for this reason. Another major distinction in Great Britain is that wages do not rise and fall with the cost of provisions, something we see today as well. Even though we've seen record inflation, there has been some upward pressure on how much people are paid, but if you look at what people are paid today versus 5 years ago, there's not much difference. And if you look at how much things cost versus 5 years ago, there's a substantial difference. In some cases, like a 50% increase. Yet the cost maintains, laborers. Another major distinction in Great Britain is that wages do not rise and fall with the cost of provisions. Every year the cost of living would fluctuate, but this did not have an immediate impact on what people were paid. When things are expensive, this could push a family to the brink of ruin. But when costs are low, they would live in relative abundance. Smith also comments on an interesting phenomenon, where the cost of provisions vary more across time, while those of wages vary more according to location. And we still kind of see that today. People in the same company will earn 30% less if they work over in Britain versus in the United States for whatever reason, even though they do the exact same job. Bread and meat might be nearly the same price throughout the whole of the UK, but what people can earn will change dramatically depending on their neighborhood. Sometimes you could travel just a few miles and see a decrease in wages of up to 20%. He adds that these differences in the cost of wages and goods were often in contrast. Where the wages were lowest were often the same places where the cost of bread would be the highest. Luckily, we don't see that today. Everybody in the U.S. knows that people in California usually have much higher wages, but everybody also knows that California has one of the highest cost of livings in the United States today. So, luckily, we're not dealing with the opposite, where people in Mississippi would be paying the highest cost of living. Fortunately, Mississippi, even though it has some of the lowest wages, does have one of the lowest cost of living today. Grain was the common people's main source of calories for centuries, and it cost more in Scotland than in England during the time of Smith. English corn sold at a lower price in English markets than Scotland, yet it was cheaper than the corn grown domestically. How much flour a type of grain yielded was the chief determinant of its quality, giving England's corn an advantage. However, despite its superior appearance, in reality, people could afford it better. Laborers earn less in England, though, so if they could support themselves there, they would be affluent in Scotland. Scottish folk fed on oatmeal for the majority of their caloric intake. Adam cautions us to avoid a common misperception when examining these differences. The low cost of sustenance in Scotland was not the result of poverty, but rather the cause of it. In the century preceding Smith's time, grain was costlier in both parts of the kingdom, and labor was sold at a lower price as well. English improvements in agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce started sooner than in Scotland, and labor demand rose according to this trend. Without a national labor board to record the common wages paid to workers, it is impossible to say with any certainty how much people earned. Nevertheless, Smith's figures that labor's real value and what it could purchase had increased over the preceding century more than its money price. Grain decreased in price, as did many other food sources, widening access to nutrition among the working poor. Potatoes, apples, and onions, on the other hand, fell to half their previous price, and manufactured goods, such as linen and wool, followed these price changes. However, soap, liquor, and candles saw increased prices because of extra taxes levied upon them. Yet these price increases hardly affected the poor, thanks to the prevalent cost decreases seen in other goods. Smith asks the question of whether the advancement of the poorer classes is a net benefit or detriment to the whole of society. His answer was that whatever advanced the greater portion of a nation could never be considered an inconvenience to the whole. Quote, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." End quote. He claimed it was only equitable that those who fed and clothed the whole populace should share in the produce of their labor. Poverty may discourage marriage, although it does not prevent it. Smith does note that poverty may encourage the producing of offspring, and he comments on how the poor could be the parents of up to 20 children. Yet an upper-class woman might only produce 2 or 3. And I mean, we've even seen that here in America. Several generations ago, it was not uncommon for families to have, 5+ children, but we would consider that to be fairly extreme today, I would assume most of us. Even though poverty fails to reduce the generation of offspring, it detriments the rearing of children.
Smith says that the poor woman who have 20 children may only be found with 2 or 3 alive. Child mortality rates dropped dramatically with rising affluence, and the upper classes often raised their children to adulthood, while the common people would have half of theirs die before they reached the age of 9 or 10. All animals multiply in proportion to their sustenance, and none can go beyond this limit. The inferior members of civilized society were the only humans who ran into this limitation and watched their children perish without the means to sustain them. As a result, the generous rewarding of labor enables workers to raise more of their kids to maturity. Interestingly, the number of children raised to adulthood often corresponds to the demand for labor. So in thriving societies, the reward for work leads to more fruitful partnerships. As the reward of labor falls, a deficiency in hands is sure to follow, and this in turn raises the demand and reward again. Then the multiplication of workers counteracts this force and creates a natural equilibrium. Smith says the demand for men is regulated by the same market laws as any other commodity and determines the propagation of all societies. And so basically, he's just saying that when there are too many workers competing for too few jobs, it drives down the price of labor, and that actually raises child mortality rates. However, whenever the number of adults falls again because of those raised child mortality rates, all of a sudden there are fewer hands to fulfill the number of job openings in a society, which pushes up the wages again, and that in turn makes it possible for more people to raise their kids to adulthood. Slaves were a liability for their masters, as were journeymen for their employers. Nonetheless, employers spent less to maintain their employees than a master would for his slaves. For that reason, Smith's belief was that the work of free men was always cheaper than that of slaves, even in areas where the prevailing wages are high. Liberal payments to laborers are an effect of increasing national wealth and population, so complaining about it would be to lament over the greatest public prosperity. Progressive, advancing societies give the happiest lives to every station of society, and the wealthy, from the wealthy to the poor. Stagnant and declining social systems are difficult for every class, even those at the top. Higher wages not only improve the society's rate of expansion, but also the industry of common folk. Who would have guessed that paying people more made them more motivated to work? Labor's wages are an encouragement to industry. The higher the wages are, the more industry will thrive. Sufficient sustenance enables workers to live healthier, gives them the hope to better his condition, and promises a comfortable retirement. As such, we find that people are more motivated to work where wages are highest, compared to where they are low. Even if some men will be satisfied working 4 days a week, if that can sustain him, this is by no means the case for all of them. When workers are amply rewarded for their labor, they frequently work harder and longer to the point of ruining their health. Smith mentions that English carpenters were not expected to last longer than 8 years in their prime condition, and this was also seen in other industries paid by the project. Accordingly, many artisans are plagued by conditions peculiar to their line of work or trade. Sometimes soldiers would be paid in line with their production, and in these cases officers often had to intervene to prevent the destruction of their health. They would limit how much a soldier could earn in a given day, so as to preserve their wellness. Strenuous labor of the body and mind is typically followed by long periods of rest, or at least that is the desire, and this was a common complaint among employers. Still is kind of nowadays. Smith said that masters would benefit from listening to their workers and giving them enough time to relax instead of prodding them to overwork. His thoughts were that workers who could regulate their production usually produced the greatest amount over the year, and they would outlast their overworked associates. Some have claimed that workers are idle during abundant times and more industrious when things are lean. Nevertheless, Smith counters this narrative and says men work hardest when well-fed and in good spirits. If they experience frequent sickness and have a broken spirit, they are less industrious and more likely to die. Early deaths definitely decrease their lifetime production. During plentiful times, servants may desire to leave their masters and venture out to work on their own. However, on the same token, abundance will encourage a master to hire more servants. Farmers also follow this strategy and aim to generate more profit from their corn by hiring additional hands. Yet the number of people willing to work as servants fall, and this pushes up the prevailing wage. Scarce years see a reversal of this trend, where servants are more eager to return and work for a master. Since it is more difficult and uncertain to make a living on their own in these episodes, and the price of provisions tend to be higher, they flock to employers and push down wages. Masters are unwilling to hire as many because the cost to provide for them raises. Independent workers also consume the material of their production and are reduced to journeymen who work for subsistence. Employers are therefore more likely to offer better terms of employment during a bull market rather than a recession. Landlords or farmers are happier with abundant times, as the cost of rents and profits track the price of provisions. Smith tells us that it would be absurd to say a man who employs themselves earn less than those who work for another. Poor independent workers will often be more productive than a journeyman who is paid by his output. One of them enjoys all the fruits of his labor, while the other must share it with a master. In addition, independent workmen do not have to contend with bad company, which often demoralizes people who work in factories. Even during hard times, the life of the independent worker will still be greater than those who are employed. A French economist, Mr. Maissance, looked at the production of several factories to try and show how workers produce more when the economy is cheap. His work appeared to show the desired correlation, but Smith investigated this phenomenon and found no such evidence. In 1740, there was great scarcity, and many manufacturing plants lowered their output. Yet in 1756, there was another scarce year, and Scottish manufacturers actually increased production, in contrast to the supposed trend. Large manufacturers' production depends less on how things are going at home, but more on the market conditions where they sell. Public registries rarely record the amount of work done outside the large-scale operations, until here recently, thanks to the Census Bureau. Men would leave their employment and work independently, and they sold their produce to neighbors. And back then, they would fall off the book, so to speak, so it's hard to track what they did. Even though labor costs may vary from the cost of provisions, it would be unwise to assume provision pricing has no impact on wages. Demand for labor and the cost of living are the two largest factors determining how much people are paid. More workers are hired when there is plenty of money in the economy, and it diminishes when the money dries up. Since more employers are looking to hire, they must compete with each other, and this elevates the wages of employees. Nevertheless, when there is sudden scarcity, the opposite occurs. Less money is available to go after workers, and large numbers of people are laid off or fired. Then these unemployed workers must compete with each other to find new jobs, and this pushes down the cost of wages. And that is it for Chapter 8, folks. This is a wandering author here, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. And my questions to you are, what are y'all doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your local communities today? Because you can count on me to do mine daily. Till next time, God bless.